Welcome to the New Books Network.
The Russian invasion of Ukraine has already changed the world. Why did it happen? Who's winning? How will it end? Christopher Miller is the author of The War Came to Us, Life and Death in Ukraine. Welcome to you.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
And could you just start by really explaining your personal connection with Ukraine? Because you didn't start off there. You're a journalist now. You didn't start off as a journalist there.
I did begin my career. I've always been a journalist, but I did take a 2-year break or hiatus in 2010, 2010 through 2012, and I left the U.S. and went to Ukraine as a United States Peace Corps volunteer, which is a 27-month commitment. And you don't really get to choose where you go. And I didn't, at that time, have a particular interest in Ukraine, and I didn't have any family connections or any other types of connections to Ukraine, actually. And I had hoped to go to someplace in Africa. Instead, the Peace Corps sent me to Ukraine. And then upon arrival here, I found out that I would be going even further and toward the east of the country to a city by the name then of Artyomovsk, which is now called Bakhmut, and found myself just a few hours from the Russian border in this city of around 70 to 80,000 people, predominantly Russian speakers. It felt quite a ways away from the capital of Kiev. It was about a 13, 14-hour overnight train ride, followed by either a 20-minute taxi ride or a 40-minute bus ride to the city. And then I found myself there as the only American in that city, and learned Russian quickly. Tried to do what I could to integrate into that city and its society. And I spent the next 2 years there working in a couple of the city's schools, helping out the city government with various events, helping some community organizations, and also found my way around the region. And so I would do some journalism lectures and courses in the regional capital of Donetsk, as well as some other various things at cities in the region there. And so over that period of 2 years, I really got to know what is called the Donbass, or the eastern region that comprises both the Donetsk and Lugansk regions in eastern Ukraine, and also the people and the culture, which really kind of gave me a baseline and this important background and knowledge of the country that has really come in handy in recent years covering Russia's war against Ukraine.
Yes, well, exactly. There can't be many people reporting on Bakhmut, as many journalists around the world did in recent months, who actually lived there. So it does put you in an extraordinary position, really. I mean, when you lived in those bits of Donbass, what did you gather at that stage about the attitudes of the Russians living there towards Russia, towards Ukraine, and the Ukrainians living there, ethnically Ukrainian people, about what they felt about it all? What was your understanding of the politics before the invasion?
Yeah, when I arrived there, I really made an effort to keep a very open mind. Again, I didn't know much about Ukraine at the time, and I was learning Russian, and really everything was brand new to me. So I wanted to come in completely open to everything, and I sort of set this this rule for myself, which was that barring any sort of crazy, outlandish request, I would say yes to just about everything, so that I would find myself in new situations, sometimes some uncomfortable situations, but always these types of places and situations in which I would learn a lot. And there were some outside views of Eastern Ukraine as being this place that was very pro-Russian, because it was a place known to be home to people who speak predominantly Russian. And what I found was a place that was much more complex than what most people believed the region to be. For example, there was a large Ukrainian contingent of ethnic Ukrainians and Ukrainian speakers. It was a Ukrainian speaking area prior to Russia's industrialization of the region, almost 100 years ago now. And the Soviets really built up the region to mine its coal mines, to work its large steel and metal factories there, and they brought in Russians, ethnic Russians, and Russian speakers, which over decades, really had an impact on the region and shaped it into, this place where there was a larger affinity toward Russia and sympathies toward Russia than, say, for example, here in Kiev or someplace further west in the country. But a lot of people there had a strong regional identity. Many people would identify themselves as people from the Donbass. Nobody told me that they wanted to, just for example, give up their Ukrainian citizenship and join Russia. Really, very few people ever said, something along those lines, and most of them were people of retired age who were somewhat nostalgic for the Soviet Union and the quote unquote good old days. Many younger people, working age people, were happy to be Ukrainian, or at the very least, absolutely fine with being in independent Ukraine. And many people, didn't want to be a part of Russia. They saw, they were looking across the border and also reading news reports about how the political situation in Russia was devolving under Vladimir Putin. And they were happy to be in independent Ukraine if they were also a little bit frustrated with Ukraine's government in Kiev and with the political situation there. And regarding politics, I would say that most people, while they voted for a party that was Russia friendly, the Party of Regions, which was headed by the then President Viktor Yanukovych, who would later be ousted by Ukraine's revolutionaries in 2013 and 2014, they were very apathetic. People really just wanted to go about their lives, go to work, be with their families. There was a lot of people that I knew and was close with there really sort of worked for the weekend. They weren't necessarily like many American friends of mine and maybe even myself, who are largely defined by what they do professionally. Many people were proud to do the work that they did, but their best moments and what they really wanted to do were spent, with their family and the people they cared about.
Now then, I sort of said in the intro we'd look at why did it happen, basically where is it now and where's it going. So on the why did it happen, I think many people will, given all the coverage that's been pretty familiar with the two versions of history that are out there. But perhaps you could just sort of briefly run through the Russian version, and in particular Putin's version, because he wrote a document, didn't he, quite a long time before the invasion, giving his view of Ukraine and its status. So what is the Putin version of Ukrainian history?
Well, the Putin version of Ukraine is that Ukraine is a manufactured place. It's not a real country. It was created by the Soviets, and essentially it was a swath of territory given to people who identified as Ukrainians. Vladimir Putin's revisionist history sees Ukrainians as not real people, but Russians who have gone awry. He doesn't believe in the Ukrainian language or in Ukrainian culture, and he has now set out to destroy those things: the language, the culture, and the people. Many Ukrainians argue that this is a genocidal war, that Putin wants to completely eradicate them and their country, not just subjugate Ukraine, but to completely destroy it. And just when you get down to it, Vladimir Putin really doesn't want this place to exist. But he's come up against a people who are very proud to be who they are, and they are the Ukrainians. And so, switching to what what Ukraine's view is. Ukraine has been around for centuries, and the Ukrainians love to boast that there was life and a city in Kiev and a ruler in Kiev long before there was in Moscow. The quip here is that Kiev was a city before, while Russia was still while Moscow was still a forest. And the Ukrainians have essentially been fighting for their freedom and independence for centuries against Russian imperialism. This is just essentially the latest chapter of it. But what they are facing right now to them is an existential fight. This is nothing less than a fight for survival. It's not a conflict between Russia and the West, even though there are elements of that. This is very much a war that targets them, and Vladimir Putin and his propagandists who have gone on television, and many of his military generals who have spoken out as well, have said what he has said, and that is that the Ukrainians need not to exist, and so that's what the Ukrainians are fighting against. That is why they will not give up. And they are, of course, asking for all sorts of military equipment and support from us in the West. Whether or not they get it, they will continue to fight because of that very thing that I've just explained there.
There's another part of the history which you'll be in a great position to make a comment on. The Russian version is that the Ukrainians are Nazis. And there's the whole history of the Second World War in Ukraine. Can you take us through what the Germans did in Ukraine in the Second World War, how complicit Ukrainians were in that? And then I'll ask you another question about it. So first of all, let's just do the background.
Sure. So Nazi Germany did invade Ukraine and the Soviet Union, Soviet Ukraine at the time, during World War II. They pushed their way eastward, first from the city that we know now today as Lviv, going all the way to modern-day Russia. Even when I was living in Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine in 2011, I passed some city workers that were exhuming the bodies of Nazi soldiers from the central square. So they really did make their way across all of Ukraine. And they were met by stiff resistance by the Red Army and also by partisans fighting them in the streets, with makeshift weapons. In Western Ukraine, however, there was a contingent of Ukrainian nationalists who viewed the Soviet communist leadership as political nemesis as well, and were passionate about Ukrainian independence. And so when the Nazis came marching into their territories, some of them linked up with them and did fight against the Red Army, thinking that they might be able to carve out something of their own and declare an independent Ukraine. So this was a small group of collaborators that did carry out some atrocities against Poles, for example, and did join up with some of the factions within the Nazi army. Their dream of a small little independent Ukraine at the time, of course, did not work out. But it's this small contingent of Ukrainian nationalists, because of their very short period of collaboration with the Nazis, again, because they were against communist rule, that today's Russia and Vladimir Putin has used this idea that today's war is a continuation of that Ukrainians remain so extreme in their nationalism that they are Nazis, or some in Russia would say neo-Nazis, and that is what he is fighting against, and what Russian soldiers are fighting against. The continuation of the war that their grandfathers fought. Now, that can't be further from the truth, of course. We have a Jewish president here in Ukraine. A Muslim defense minister was just appointed. This is a country of various religions, and there are no more Nazis than there are in any other country that has some kind of small marginalized faction of some political activist types.
You mentioned there was a small number of collaborators actively fighting and responsible for some terrible attacks and murders and so on. Was there a wider feeling amongst when we're talking now the older generation in Ukraine, barely alive still, but amongst those who lived through the Second World War, that the German, I've heard this remark, that the German occupiers were better than the Russian occupiers, which doesn't mean that people were collaborating, but just that their experience of the war was that they preferred it under the Germans than they did under the Russians.
That's interesting. I haven't heard that myself. I can't say that I've interviewed anyone still alive today who remembers that time. I've read a couple of Ukrainian reports that have had interviews with people from that time, and I haven't seen that necessarily. However, I mean, just looking at what the Nazis did in Ukraine then, and seeing for myself what the Russians have done and are doing to Ukrainians in Ukraine right now. I mean, these are both armies, have committed and are committing now, Russia, horrific atrocities. And I don't imagine, I really don't want to say that life under the Nazis was good,
No,
or certainly not. It certainly wasn't. It certainly wasn't good. But I can tell you that what I know from my reporting here and my Ukrainian friends and acquaintances, including those people who have lived under Russian occupation, is that it's an absolute nightmare. It's total repression and oppression, and it's people being locked in basements and tortured and abused, and forced re-education, and all sorts of atrocities. Mass graves turn up everywhere we go when there's a new village or a town liberated here by the Ukrainian forces. And so, I don't think that life under either was good at all, but certainly what is being experienced now is also horrific.
You will have seen, I'm sure, these social media videos of Ukrainians apparently naturally shot. I mean, they like a lot of fake news, they appear genuine. And I'm going to ask you whether you think these are fake or not. Of Nazi salutes and such things. Have you ever? I mean, you've been there throughout this thing. Have you ever seen that? And if not, do you think these social media messages are literally just fakes, or do you think they're, as you say, there's always a very small group in every country that has these sympathies, and it's those people? What do you make of it all?
Well, I think the latter, and I will say that I'm somebody who has covered the far right and extremism in various places. The United States, I spent several months covering our extremists in the United States and the far right. I've covered far right extremism across Europe, including some of the factions here in Ukraine. The Azov Battalion of 2014 and some of their splinter street movements and political party here I've covered, because the U.S. State Department had labeled one of those outfits as a nationalist hate group. These groups do exist, but they're on a very, very small scale. I think that they get outsized attention oftentimes, including from us in the media, because of that sensational element of this being not just a hobby club or anything, but if somebody puts up a Nazi salute, or you see a Nazi related symbol, I mean, Nazi Germany, that rings a lot of bells for people, right? And raises concerns. These groups, though, are very marginal here, and the Ukrainians are the first to say that there is no far right party that has a faction in parliament here, while there are plenty in the EU who do. That it is true that there are men on the front line who wear far right patches, who certainly have symbols on their clothing, or they make posts on social media that are related to Nazism or extremism in some way. But again, I will just underscore that they are a very, very small number of people. That even in my home country of the United States, we have an issue with far right extremists in the military. That I know in the last few years has been a major topic of discussion. And I would not say that there is a problem in Ukraine that is any larger than that. Or many other European Union countries, Germany included, which in recent years has dealt with far-right extremist groups within their security services and their police, as well as their military.
Let's go to, let me ask you, are there any other historical issues that you think people don't understand? Who might be listening to this, which is mainly a Western audience, but I should say that we have listeners in every country of the world except North Korea, I think. But where is there anything else that you think people ought to know about the history?
Well, I think. There is a lot. The short answer is there is a lot. I think a lot of people don't know, because Ukraine is this really complex place. I don't know anything that's very black and white here. And that's kind of the interesting bit of Ukraine, is that nothing is easy. Everything is rather complex. One thing off the top of my head that I sort of touched on, related to the Donbass, is that there we in the West, and also Ukraine's own political parties historically since independence, have sort of looked at Ukraine as East versus West, the pro-Russian side versus the pro-Western side of the country, and that's not accurate. There always has been pro-Russian and anti-Russian sympathy in various places. It is a country that is bilingual predominantly, but increasingly multilingual. English is heard everywhere here. There's a group of people who now are coming of age and are young working adults that don't recall the Soviet Union. They were born in just before the collapse of the USSR or just afterward. They really were raised in independent Ukraine, and they have a very pro-Western view of the world. They're very progressive. They've traveled. They have experiences that are similar to those that we have in the West. They take vacations in the Czech Republic or Italy or France just like we do, and it's increasingly becoming a westernized European country. It's not some backwater in Eastern Europe or a former Soviet republic or a post-Soviet place anymore. It very much is a European country that feels as European as anywhere else that I've traveled, and I think that is what's really important, because I think a lot of times when I go back to I stop in London or I go home to New York or elsewhere, a lot of people I find are very interested in Ukraine, but they do still have this idea of it being somewhere far flung and in maybe even sort of historically belonging to Russia. They're unaware of that history that you and I talked about, and they think it's some kind of backwater where people are living rough and is some kind of second world country or third world country, and that isn't the case. I can tell you just a couple of funny details here. I mean, I have never lived or worked in a place where the trains in the metro system run to the minute, where I don't have to carry around a wallet because everything is digitalized and I can just pay with my phone. It's very much or a place where I've had as fast of Wi-Fi as I do now in my apartment here in central Kiev. So just a few examples of what I think are sort of glossed over or not fully realized.
Yeah, I mean, I could just say that I actually visited Kiev in the communist days and saw, frankly, how grim it was. Particularly on the outskirts of Kiev, I was looking someone up in a block of apartments there, and it was absolutely miserable.
Yeah. Oh, well, you'd be surprised how far it's come now.
Yeah, well, exactly. Now, I did go back to cover a bit of the fighting before this invasion, but to cover some of the stuff going on in eastern Ukraine, and was struck by exactly what you say, that the difference was just astonishing. And, this was all done without European Union membership. I mean, I've seen it in other East European countries where the EU accession process forced them to modernise much more quickly than I thought they would otherwise have done. But in Ukraine, they did it really without even EU membership. I'm sure maybe not to the same degree, but nonetheless, it's exactly as you describe. It's a modern European country. When we get to the current political situation, Zelensky is beginning to take some knocks in the Western press, having had hero worship basically up until now. Where does he stand in Ukrainian public opinion?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think he began taking some knocks here in Ukraine long before he did from the Western media and international community. A lot of Ukrainians. Well, first of all, if you look back, taking a step back to his election, right? He won with over 70% of the vote against a deeply unpopular president, Petro Poroshenko. That popularity allowed him to secure a majority in parliament over the next few months. He made some big campaign promises. One was to end the war with Russia and also to stamp out corruption. He was unable to deliver on those immediately. And Ukrainians, they grow tired of their political leaders very quickly. They love change here. They've only once re-elected a president in their independent history. And so within the first year, President Zelensky's popularity had fallen. By the time the Russian full-scale invasion began, his popularity had dropped to, if I remember correctly, just around 30%, give or take, maybe a little bit more. But that's more than half of his more than half of the percentage in which he won the presidential election just a few years prior. So when the war began, in those first few days, there were a lot of really angry, very frustrated, very confused people. It was a chaotic situation, of course. Missiles were falling down, Russian jets were in the sky, Ukrainians were fleeing by the millions to Western Ukraine or the border, and a lot of them were asking, why weren't we prepared? Why didn't our president tell us we should, prepare for something like this? And you'll recall that Western intelligence was warning of a full-scale invasion, and President Zelensky was saying, please don't cause panic in the country. We're keeping an eye on things. But they were reading the intelligence differently. Zelensky and his team were looking at Western intelligence reports and saying, we see the same numbers that you see, and we see the same Russian military units you see, but looking at those, we don't think that's enough to launch a full-scale invasion. So in that sense, they were right. But the Russians were bold enough to try it anyway, and that's where they were wrong. And so this invasion did happen on a massive scale, and troops were pushing toward Kiev, and Ukrainians were unprepared, largely unprepared. And so there were traffic jams, there were people, rushing to pull money out of the bank. Gas was almost nowhere to be found for a few weeks here. And I think because of that, a lot of people, were very frustrated with Zelensky, and I think that remained for a very short period of time. But they began to see also this new Zelensky emerge, this wartime president emerge. He steps out from his bunker inside of his presidential administration onto the street with some of his top officials and gives what is probably the most important and yet shortest speech of his presidential career. I think it's roughly 40 seconds long, and he says, "I'm here. We are here." And he tells Ukrainians to fight, that he's not going to leave their side. He's in Kiev. They're working. And I think from that point forward through the next roughly year, they were very supportive of their president. There really was this sort of unspoken rule that, you should not criticize Ukraine's leadership, including the president.
Can I just break in and just say that bit of tape? I actually use it in a lecture series I do with some students as the most astonishing bit of political communication I've ever seen. Yeah. I mean, it is so powerful and conveyed everything he wanted to say, as you say, in about 40 seconds.
Yeah. I think somebody could try to argue, but I think I would win the argument in saying that it was probably the most important thing he has done as president. Just simply staying in Kiev, making that speech. Letting people know that the president was there, the military was there, that what Russia believed would happen, and what some in the West even thought would happen. The military standing down or not being able to respond didn't. And because of that, Ukrainians still have a very overwhelmingly positive view of the president, but it's now more than a year and a half into this brutal Russian war of aggression against Ukraine and its people, and people are exhausted. And right now, when you've got a counteroffensive that's 3 months in and it hasn't produced a lot of the results that people hope for, frustrations come to the surface and people start airing grievances and asking questions. And there has been, I think, in recent weeks, if not months, a return of internal politics. There has been some criticism of the president and his decision making over the last year and a half. In some cases, the criticism has not been military related, or at least not directly, but rather how he is approaching the reform process as Ukraine progresses toward EU negotiations. In hopes of eventually becoming an EU member. So recently, one example is Ukrainians now, after allowing the president to roll back some transparency laws that were in place to prevent corruption, for security reasons, they want them to now be put back into place, and see that as really a key demand of the EU and something that needs to be done for Ukraine to become a more democratic country. And so, after some foot dragging and an online petition that got 80,000 or more signatures in I think 48 hours, the president vetoed a law that would suspend some of these civil liberties and or not civil liberties, but public asset declarations for at least another year. And now he's saying we will go forward in passing or amending legislation to make sure that we can now return these public declarations as soon as possible. So, this is one way that civil society is still, sort of holding the president's feet to the flames. At the same time, supporting him as a wartime leader.
I wanted to ask you about corruption, within the constraint of libel law. So I'll sort of word it in very general terms and just say, before the invasion, did the government, I should say it that way, have a reputation for being corrupt? The Zelensky administration, if you like. And since the war began, has that reputation, is there I'm not saying there was one before. Was there a reputation before? Is there a reputation now for corruption in the Ukrainian government?
So largely no. The Zelensky administration itself and the president himself has not been known and is not currently known among Ukrainians or thought of as being corrupt. Certainly not in the way that previous administrations were thought of as being corrupt. Many of Ukraine's previous leadership and presidents were oligarchs, businessmen. They wielded a lot of power before they came into office. They were rich tycoons, who came up in the wild 90s and sought out power as they got older and moved into the presidency. Zelensky, was an entertainer, a comedian, by comparison, certainly not an oligarch, but a successful businessman. That said, there were people that Zelensky brought into his team in the administration who were thought of as being corrupt dealers or alleged to have been involved in some bad dealings. But it was actually when Zelensky came to power, not necessarily his administration, but the country was still viewed as a place that had a corruption problem. And so that was why one of his major campaign promises was to stamp out entrenched corruption that has existed, throughout its independent history. And he made some progress. There were some laws passed and some things done at the request of the EU or under pressure by Ukrainian society that Zelensky was able to do prior to the full-scale invasion. That corruption fight slowed significantly after Russia invaded in February 2022, for obvious reasons. When you have to respond militarily, a lot of the rest of what you have going on gets set aside. But we're at this point now, more than a month and a half in, where Ukraine wants to walk and chew gum at the same time. They want to be able to conduct their counteroffensive, beat back Russian forces, and show that they're serious about joining the EU, and in doing so, continue working on these reforms, including the very crucial anti-corruption reforms that are needed.
When you look at Ukrainian society today, I mean, I've spoken to a young Ukrainian who thinks that the mood has changed in the country and that there is a demoralization now about the situation, that in the big cities like Kyiv, there are people who are depressed about what's happening and not really anticipating victory, that on the front lines are young men who feel that the public isn't really with them as strongly as they were, but are fighting largely to honour the memory of their comrades who've died, and that there is a morale problem. Do you see that?
I don't want to make a sweeping judgment or assessment saying that there is, a broad morale problem or that there is widespread anger and frustration, because that's not accurate. But those things do exist. People are frustrated. They are tired. They're exhausted after more than a year and a half of war and missiles falling on their head and losing loved ones and their livelihoods and in some cases their entire cities. But I still see morale relatively high. When I visit the soldiers, they on the front lines. They have low points. They'll come back from a particularly grueling fight, and maybe half of them will come back in one piece, and the other half will have been killed or badly wounded. And that's oftentimes a low point. But they'll go out the next day and they'll gain 300 meters of territory, and then they're riding high, and they come back, and there's music playing, and they celebrate with barbecue or some hot tea or something like that. Here in Kiev, I can tell you that people are still very proud of their military. They're doing everything they can to support them. It feels like everyone in some way is mobilized to help now. If they're not fighting, people are fundraising, they're advocating, lobbying for their country, trying to get attention from online. They're doing something, anything they can. You were saying that you have somebody who works with you who's from Ukraine, and that they're always thinking about people here and sending money and sending things back. That is what everyone I know here is doing. Something along those lines, and that, I think, is a way of keeping up morale and feeling as though they're all in this together. They are aware that this could go on for a while, but they also, many Ukrainians, remember that this is a war that isn't 18, 19 months old now. It's a war that's been waged by Russia for more than 9 years. So in some cases, many cases, Ukrainians have learned to live with war, and so they are, for better or worse, getting used to life in wartime and finding ways to decompress, to de-stress, to carry on life. And these things that they're doing, whether it's going out to a cafe or a restaurant or bowling or the movie theater, they're viewed as all these little acts of defiance. It's sort of a middle finger to Russia. You can attack us, bomb us, destroy our homes. You're not going to take our dignity. You're not going to stop us from living. We're going to continue on to the extent we can with our lives, and that's what I see and feel here. And it's something that is always really inspiring.
Last question to you, which is obviously, where is all this going? I mean, I heard you say, they come back with a 300-meter gain, and I've been reading that in the papers. And I must say, like everyone else, I read the stuff about the offensive this year. And then when you start reading, they've taken 300 meters, they've taken a couple of villages, you think, right, that's not working, is it? So I just wonder where you think this is headed. I mean, I think the consensus sort of analysis in the mainstream press in Europe is that it's a stalemate, and that there's years of this to come. The Russian defences are very difficult to break through, and that's where we are. Do you share that view?
To some extent. I do fear that there may be something resembling a stalemate, and I think if that is the case, what we could see is, over the course of the next many months, if not years, is just on the ground level, a really grinding war of attrition, a lot of back and forth without a lot of forward movement. In this case, it would probably mean that the Ukrainians are unable to get to the strategic city of Melitopol and cut off Russia's land bridge in the south. What I think might continue, or even be increased, is the air war, the drone war. Both Ukraine and Russia are ramping up production on drones, attack drones, surveillance drones. They've become key elements to the war, especially in recent months. That's something that could continue, or even increase over that period of time while the ground war stalls. But I don't think we should count the Ukrainians out quite yet. While everybody is talking about rainy season coming and winter coming, and that being a point in time when perhaps this counteroffensive would have to stop, the Ukrainians know how to fight in winter. They didn't stop fighting last winter. They have fought for 9 years in winter conditions. This is also a pretty cold weather country after October. So it's not like this is the first time in which they're going to be fighting in unpleasant conditions. Plus, they do have a way of surprising us. I think they've outperformed at almost every turn. Many people like to count the Ukrainians out because they have fewer resources, fewer soldiers, but they're extremely clever. They are fighting on their own turf. They know it well, and they're motivated because they know what they're fighting for, right? There's this maxim that is very popular here, which is if Russia stops fighting, the war will end. If Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine will end, right? And so they're not going to stop fighting, not in October, not in November. And I think, if they manage to deliver some kind of decisive blow to Russia that could force them to make some bad battlefield decisions, it's not out of the question that we could see Ukraine with a more advantageous position going into spring, and then perhaps with its reserves filled with more Western weaponry and better trained soldiers, and the ability again in spring to perhaps launch another counteroffensive. So I'll just sum up by saying, there are still a lot of ways in which this war can go. One concern certainly is that it could be stalemated and grind on for years and years to come. But again, I think that there are many factors here, and I'll add one more, and that is how much support we provide in the West to Ukraine is going to be another major factor.
I was going to say, you've talked about the situation in Ukraine, but the American presidential election obviously is central to this, and I think Trump's made it pretty clear he won't be providing the support that's going in now, so that would make a huge difference. But there's not much you can say about that, or anyone can say about it, because we just have to see what happens when that election takes place. Look, you've really helped us understand what's going on. You're in Kiev as we speak. You're living it. You have been for some time now. You're travelling around. You're meeting people, talking to them, writing about it. So what you've got to say carries a lot of weight, and we're very grateful for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a great conversation. I enjoyed it.